Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. The P-8I Poseidon spy planes of the Indian Navy recently detected Chinese amphibious warship Xi'an-32 in the southern Indian Ocean region earlier in September. Photographs of the ships were clicked by the surveillance aircraft before it entered Sri Lankan waters. The P-8I tracked another Chinese frigate that is part of its anti-piracy escort task force deployed in the Gulf of Aden to provide security to Chinese merchant vessels from Somali sea pirates. This comes almost a fortnight after Indian intelligence agencies warned that China was allegedly spying on Indian naval bases in the Indian Ocean through its advanced surveillance ships in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze how worrying is it for India to have Chinese surveillance ships in Indian waters. Joining me on the program today are Abhijit Singh, Head, Maritime Policy Initiative, Observer Research Foundation; Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha, retired defence expert; and Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Admiral, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and put into perspective and try and understand how much of a threat is it for India for these surveillance ships being lurking around the corner?
Well, I would say that it's really not a threat, but it is certainly a matter of concern because, the ocean is a very vast space and you will have these ships coming, going and doing sort of snooping on you. But you must keep a track of them, and it is good that the P-8I actually located the ships just about when they crossed the Malacca Strait, and they have been sort of shadowing them, as they call it. The point is that if we have an advance warning, then from our shore stations and our ships, they wouldn't do any weapon related exercises in this area where there are chances of compromise of the frequencies of the radars and frequencies of the weapon systems. So that precaution is always taken if you have intelligence. But let me tell you that this is a very common practice amongst the navies, that you go and do a bit of surveillance and reconnaissance well in advance. And you mentioned that it is the amphibious ship. Amphibious ship, they want to get little long legs, which gives them the ability to land troops in far off places. Primarily been created for the South China Sea Islands, and wherever the dispute of ownership, they say that these islands are ours, Spratlys and Paracel and Taiwan, to say a few of them. So I think that concern very much, but whatever Indian Navy can do, they have the shadow aircraft. They are also monitoring their transmissions. They have electronic warfare equipment which can monitor their frequencies on which they are transmitting. Concern, yes, our concern is mainly that they should not be having any big exercise with the Pakistanis, and that is a matter of big worry, but that's a different subject by itself.
Absolutely. All right, Abhijit Singh, I'd like to bring you to the picture now. The Admiral is talking about shadowing and advanced warning system and so on and so forth. Do we have the technology and the wherewithal to spot, identify and probably even engage some of these ships that are in Indian waters?
Well, we do have advanced technology for that purpose, but let me first offer a clarification to this report that has come in the media yesterday. This ship that has been sighted in the Indian Ocean, apparently it's the Xi'an-152, which the report claims is an amphibious carrier. The Xi'an, to the best of my understanding, is a Type 52 Charlie destroyer. It's not an amphibious ship, and what China does is that China sends these anti-piracy deployments to the Indian Ocean to be deployed off Somalia and carry out piracy patrols. Usually they send a Type 52 Charlie and a Type 54, which is a frigate. So you have one frigate, one destroyer, and with that there is also a supply ship that is usually there. So this is just part of the 32nd Chinese deployment into the Indian Ocean that has come, and it's exchanging places with the 31st deployment. So in that respect, I think there is nothing for us to be unduly alarmed about. What I think is a bit of a concern is that there was also an intelligence ship that was sighted, that has been sighted near the Andamans. But again, let's be clear that Chinese intelligence ships, the Dongdaeyo class, are now a regular feature of Chinese deployments around the Indo-Pacific. So every time there's an exercise, be it in the Andamans or the South China Sea or any place in the Western Pacific, there is a Chinese intelligence ship that is shadowing the ships that are exercising in that region. So that's not something that appears to be a provocation, so to speak. What's worrying actually for me is not actually the quantum of China's deployments in the Indian Ocean region, and the report said that there's 7 ships at any given time. But I think what's worrying is really the nature of the deployment. And what the Chinese have been doing in recently is that they have been deploying these ships for benign operations, under the cloak of benign operations, but actually doing real operationals, in a manner of speaking, surveillance in the region, to basically get to understand the strategic dynamic in this region. And that, I think, means that the Chinese have some plans to have a sort of a long-term presence in the region. Already we know they have a base in Djibouti, and a lot of these ships also go to Djibouti. But the fact also why we don't see as many Chinese ships as we did about a year ago. So a year ago there were about 11 ships that were sighted around this time. This time there are just about 6 or 7 ships. Is that the Chinese are in some ways more self-assured about their presence in the Indian Ocean region, but they want to absolutely know about what the other powers, what the other navies are doing in the region. And we are doing now an exercise with Thailand and Sri Lanka and Singapore. And I think that is one reason why you see some of these ships around these areas at the time that we are about to carry out these exercises.
All right, that having been said, Ambassador, I'd like to bring you in. Could it also be that the Chinese are trying to be a little more assertive in the region, to try and be a little more, sure of what's happening as well? Like Abhijit just pointed out, let's not forget that India is trying to collaborate with the US and with others in the region, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Are these things playing on the minds of the Chinese?
I think we have to understand all this in the context of the rise of China. It didn't happen before, but today China, it's a different China today with a huge economy, one of the world's largest, or probably the world's largest, and with commensurate military muscle being built up. And hence China is basically, you can say, spreading its wings into areas which it had not done before. And clearly the oil supply routes are a major, oil and trade supply routes. I think 60% of this seaborne trade that of the world which goes through this region is a very important factor. And that is why China would like to be present here, so as to protect the sea lines of communication. And of course Djibouti is meant for that also. Plus the fact that they can have a base there and deploy and redeploy their vehicles, soldiers and other equipment from there, shows that China is now willing to venture way beyond what it had done before. And I think their new Chinese doctrine clearly mentions that we will now be in the maritime domain, go much further than what we have done before. But let me also add that the question of whether we should be alarmed and etc. or concerned, of course we should be concerned that Chinese ships are hovering around India in the Indian Ocean. But then this happens all the time in the maritime domain. I think even friendly navies also spy on each other, and that is a fact. So in case of China, which is not so friendly, I think it is only the situation demands that we do look at them and keep a track of them, just as others are keeping a track of the Chinese ships and activities, and they are keeping a track of other ships and other nations' activities. So I think that way it's a normal activity in the maritime domain. But then what you have to see the intent ultimately. What is the intent? I mean, are they just merely adopting certain surveillance modes to see what others are doing, which is fine. I think we do the same and others do the same. But then what is the intent? China, clearly there is an intention of being more sort of making their presence felt in the Indian Ocean, also gathering experience of how to operate in the Indian Ocean, and also maybe under the garb of free passage, which is a right that we all have under the UNCLOS, etc., is to also do certain operational measures, that maritime measures that they can, to gather experience in this region.
Right. All right. So, Admiral, just taking the point forward that the ambassador has just made, what is the intent really? And how is this intelligence going to be used going forward? Because with the Chinese, it's not just black and white, is it?
There is a lot of gray in Chinese operations. Let me give you one example. In 2013, they had this very famous oceanographic research vessel. And the ship was hovering in the Indian Ocean for more than 2-3 months. And all that he was doing was he was towing a probe which was underwater and monitoring the hydrological conditions of the Indian Ocean. Now, hydrological conditions are very important on two accounts. One is that you get to know what kind of anti-submarine weapon you should have, or the sonar systems which can track the submarines of the adversary and how deep they are. You know, they have these temperatures make difference, the pressures make difference, the density makes difference. So how is the propagation of the sound wave underwater? So that's an important point. So that will also give them an idea as to how will they be using their own submarines or anti-submarine systems and the weapons in case push comes to shove. That is number one. The second thing is that, you know, they also have this great love with the satellite communication, and each of their ship has now is carrying a the conformal antenna which can talk to the satellite, and they want to see how far they can communicate. Clearly, there was a nuclear submarine which was about to come to Indian Ocean those days, and rightly so. The communication between the nuclear submarine and Beijing had to be through this oceanographic research ship. Till such time, we went very close, and we took the photographs of this antenna and gave it to our IT boys, and they said this is for satellite communication. So how does a submarine talk to satellite? It talks through this ship, and the ship passes it to a satellite, maybe a low Earth orbit satellite or some kind of satellite which was launched, especially when INS Vikramaditya was on its maiden passage from Murmansk to Karwar. So the moment they emerged from the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, these guys were waiting to note the conditions or the acoustic data of the aircraft carrier, so that a submarine can find out the target by acoustic data as well. If you get 2-3 propellers running and this is the kind of noise, then it is an aircraft carrier, or it is a destroyer, or it is a Delhi class, whichever. And then accordingly the weapon systems can be so tuned so that it can home on to those kind of acoustic systems. So these are the surveillance measures for underwater surveillance. And similarly, the wave propagation over sea and different atmospheres in different parts of the world is fairly different, and therefore your communication channels, the ducts are different, what kind of systems which will function here. So that gives you a very good idea as to what you should do. Ultimately, the Chinese intention is to displace the American from number one position militarily as well. And why not? I mean, everybody does it, like the ambassador says. So does China. So we have to be concerned. We have to make sure that we don't lose out in keeping a track of these Chinese ships. If he is not doing anything nasty, then it's fine. But if it is likely to become a problem for you, then you might as well tell him to push off.
Taking the discussion forward, and just to bring in another element, Abhijit, is the fact that, you can call it routine, you can call it normal, you can call it, the unsaid law, you can call them the unsaid laws of the seas, but the same is not reciprocated when you look at South China Sea.
Oh, that is absolutely true. See, one of the things that where I completely agree with Admiral Sinha is that one of the reasons why China does this, and it does this not only with us, but it does this with other nations also, both in the Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific, is that the Chinese are always in the lookout to size up their opponents. And you size up the opponents by being in their waters and observing what they do. And that then gives you an idea of what is it that how much dominance can they assert in their own waters, and are they a threat to you in your own waters? So when they make an assessment of Indian capabilities and the kinds of exercises that India is doing with Thailand or Singapore or the US or whichever other navy, that gives them an idea of how effective we are going to be in our own waters in interdicting Chinese shipping if it comes to that. And the other more important thing is that for how long can we sustain a presence in Chinese waters? Having said that, I would go on to say that really we have to understand what the Chinese strategy in the Indian Ocean is. The Chinese strategy in the Indian Ocean is not really a full spectrum dominance strategy. This is a strategy of incremental control. The full spectrum dominance is in the South China Sea, because that is an area that the Chinese are extremely sensitive about. And the strategy that they follow, which was propounded by their Admiral Lu Hua King, is that they have to dominate their own waters. But in the Indian Ocean, what they want to do is that they want to initially start off by being a stakeholder. They want to have incremental presence, and that's again the point that Admiral Sinha mentions is very relevant. They want to study the operating environment, the operational environment of this place, so that they can then have a littoral mode of operations. Now, it's very interesting that when the Chinese send their submarines to the Indian Ocean region, these submarines tend to spend a lot of time in South Asian, in South Asia, around the Andamans, around Sri Lanka, before they go on to the Western Indian Ocean. And one of the reasons why the Chinese do this is to know what is the bathymetry, what is the temperature, profile of those waters, and that means that the Chinese are looking at operations that would give them a sustained presence in our waters. That does not mean they want to dominate these seas. This simply means that they want to be a relevant force. But let's be clear, if the Chinese are going to be, the more relevance the Chinese have in our waters, the less impact we will have as a net security provider, because the Chinese can do exactly the same things that we can do in these waters. And therefore, I think we should watch the Chinese strategy unfold in our waters with a very keen eye. And we should be clear that what the Chinese are trying to do actually is not dominate the space physically, but what they're trying to do is to combine a series of measures, both on the infrastructure developmental front, with diplomacy, with naval deployments, to become a regionally dominant force that can de facto dominate the region. And I think that is one of the things that we don't talk about enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. Talking about strategy and what we need to do, Ambassador, what do we need to do diplomatically? Do we continue, talking and dealing with more like-minded people in the region? For the Quad, for instance, maybe should we take it up a notch, do something new? What do you think?
I think in diplomatic terms, what we are doing, in fact, is what we call hedging. In the sense that since the intention of the Chinese have to be read, and for us, the Chinese are not a friendly power. So we must begin from the premise that they are an unfriendly presence. Hence, the usual steps that diplomatically we have to take, we have already taken that. For example, by positioning our capabilities in conjunction with the Americans. The French also now, I think we are having similar agreements where we get access to their logistical agreements that give access to each other's naval bases, etc. So I think these are some of the steps, beginning of a certain amount of pushback. I wouldn't use the word containment, but I would say some counterbalancing of the Chinese presence. That China also gets a message that there are not just India, but America, Australia, Singapore, and others who are all stakeholders in the Indian Ocean region. The French, for example, are there also, and they are also tying up in terms of their facilities and other arrangements with India. So I think that also sends out a message to the Chinese that India is not allied, but India has arrangements, let's say, with some of the major powers, maritime powers in the Indian Ocean region. And then China has to keep an eye on that also, that if it crosses a certain sort of limits, and since Indian Ocean, the region is not Chinese backwaters, as the South China Sea, they regard it as backwater, they naturally want to be a stakeholder. But of course, if the USA, the French, and the Indians, vacate this space, then Chinese will take over. That is for sure. So our intention and our goal should be that China remains a Pacific sort of a peaceful stakeholder and not go beyond certain limits.
Okay, all right. So that having been said, Admiral, what are the concerns or challenges and difficulties that India faces in the IOR?
Well, I think with the increased number of ships, and not so friendly as the ambassador says, our capability in terms of numbers must increase. The Navy has already gone into mission-based deployment, and every choke point is actually virtually under surveillance 24/7. But to sustain that at those distances, you will require certain number of ships, certain number of submarines and aircraft, and those numbers need to be increased, because now you are monitoring larger number of forts, and signaling is very important. Like Ambassador mentioned, that they must get a message. So messaging a military posture is important, and therefore unless you project yourself, or if you have a strong force, the Chinese don't listen to anybody who's slightly weaker than them. They will take you seriously only if you show that you are powerful enough. Doklam is a very good example for that. So that is number one. The second issue is that it is certainly going to restrain our freedom of maneuvering that we have had in the Indian Ocean, because now you are always wondering that are the Chinese monitoring? Are they having another exercise with the Pakistanis? The Pakistanis are going to become more emboldened. So that is little bit of challenge, because everything that Pakistan has is pointing at India, and the Chinese are going to keep supporting them, to make sure that the Indians are under check. So that is one challenge that we have to take it very seriously and see that you don't have a situation where these two forces collude. They're already doing a joint service exercise. They just had two air forces exercise in the northwest. So soon you will have naval exercises already on. When they come out of the Gulf of Aden, they always have an exercise with the Pakistani Navy. So we have to watch out for the manner in which their influence is increasing in the Indian Ocean, having taken away your neighbors by economic influence. Now if they have military influence, then you might become less relevant for your own neighbors, and that's not a very good news, either diplomatically or militarily. So these two are, I think, to my mind, are the big challenge.
Absolutely. Abhijit Singh, so what's the best way forward? Do we need better technology? Do we need better strategies? What is it?
Look, let me just begin by saying that I agree with Admiral Sinha in the problem that we're facing in the Indian Ocean region. The way I like to characterize the problem really is that we find ourselves in this very odd position that we are tactically dominant, but we are strategically defensive. So we're doing the operations and everything that in this region, but we're not going that extra mile to make sure that we're able to project power, both in the Indian Ocean as well also in the Pacific. Now let's be clear that in maritime strategy, if you have to subdue the adversary, you have to be in regions that the adversary is sensitive about. So if the Chinese are sensitive about the South China Sea, it makes sense for us to be in those waters and do some kind of, if not provoke China, not in a sense be pass close to their islands and do what the Americans call freedom of navigation operations, but have some kind of sustained presence. So the message is clear to the Chinese that if they can be in our waters, and if they can pass through our waters and have some kind of sustained presence, we can do the same to them in the South China Sea. That's one. Second, we've got to do much more with our allies and friends. For instance, the US, Australia, maybe upgrade the Malabar exercises, have a couple of more trilaterals, try and do trilateral exercises in the Western Pacific, so that again we can pass on the message to China. But the third most important thing that I think is that we are putting all our eggs in the naval operations basket. This is not just about naval operations. Look at China's strategy in the Bay of Bengal. It's not as if the Chinese dominate that space physically, in the sense they don't have ships that ply around the Bay of Bengal. But from Bangladesh to Thailand to Sri Lanka to Myanmar, they have defense deals with all of these states. The Thais recently announced that they're going to be buying their second submarine from the Chinese, a Yuan class submarine, which is pretty significant. They're also going to be buying a big amphibious 20,000 ton Cheng Bai Shan class from the Chinese. So the Thais claim. The Chinese have pressed the Thais to even reconsider the opening of the Kra Canal. So that's just Thailand for you. But look at Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, there's going to be a naval base at Cox's Bazar. That who's going to construct that? The Chinese. Look at Sri Lanka, where they have gifted away a frigate to Sri Lanka, and they're also thinking of having some kind of presence in Hambantota. Not talking about it openly, but we know for sure that in times to come, such is the control of China over Hambantota that they will have active naval presence in Chinese ports. So what I'm saying is that the Chinese, through defense deals and infrastructure projects, are doing more to dominate that region than through naval operations. We, on the other hand, tend to believe that everything is about just hard power projection, which is go and show your ships out there. That is indeed important, but that's not everything. The Chinese can do the same to us, what we think we would do to them in the South China Sea, simply by having greater arms deals and by having greater infrastructure projects and having a very strong maritime diplomacy. Let me just also add one other little thing about the Chinese understanding of maritime diplomacy. It's just not about making friends for China. It's not just about forging partnerships for China. I think the way China operates is also to use the maritime diplomacy to make inroads politically and also military-wise into regions that it has interests in. So if you look at the recent Chinese deployments in Africa, for example, it will be clear to you that the Chinese are leveraging that maritime diplomacy for many other ends. They are trying to gain greater experience in places like the Western Indian Ocean. They're also trying to get better technology. They're trying to do the intelligence, as we see happen with the Dongdaeyo class. So for China, the maritime diplomacy is a basket full of missions. For us, it's just about showing the flag. So I'm saying let's be more aggressive with our maritime diplomacy, and then I think we will be able to get a measure of China.
Absolutely. Don't be one-dimensional, be multi-dimensional.
Absolutely.
Is what you're suggesting. All right, Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think what Abhijit just now said is absolutely right, that China is using its maritime power and diplomacy not as a unidimensional thing, but as a combination, as a holistic kind of a foreign policy, which of course has the backing, the economic sort of backing, doing things in Africa everywhere. They are building ports, building corridors, the BRI itself. So it is a cohesive, it looks to be a cohesive, holistic approach in terms of foreign policy and foreign geostrategic policy. And hence one cannot see the maritime domain simply, isolated from the other aspects of China's policy. BRI, for example, the CPEC, for example, Gwadar, Djibouti, and in East Africa, and what they were trying to do in Maldives, they're trying to do in Bangladesh and trying to do in Myanmar, Thailand. All these countries are receiving that kind of holistic attention. Hence, we have to now, I'm not saying that we need to counter each and every aspect, but we have to be careful, sensitive, and we have to watch these things and take countermeasures wherever we can, with the help of friends and partners who are also dominant in this region, particularly the Americans, because they have the greatest assets in terms of maritime, sort of projection in this region. And China clearly wants to dominate this region by ousting the Americans.
Right.
In the 2015 National Security Doctrine, the American, at least this administration, made it very clear that China is the future threat in terms of it, and they are acting on it, the trade war, etc. So there is an element of counterbalancing going on by the Americans, of course, and then we have to see how much counterbalancing we have to do in our own region, in our own limited capacities that we have. And of course, we need to expand those capacities, there's no doubt about it. And maritime, I would certainly think that the maritime capabilities must receive much more attention, much more funding, budgets, etc. Because we are now looking at a different kind of an Indian Ocean region.
Absolutely. All right. Take the help of like-minded allies in the region and be more assertive is what the panelists are suggesting on the program today. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.